My name is Daniel Mercer, and I learned early that in my house, love was never something you received. It was something you earned by disappearing quietly into the background while someone else took the spotlight. My younger brother Evan was the center of everything, the golden child, the future CEO, the perfect son who could do no wrong even when he was destroying everything he touched. I, on the other hand, was the shadow they used to balance their image, the one who fixed problems no one thanked me for fixing, and took blame no one admitted assigning to me. At family dinners, Evan would sit beside my father like a crown prince being groomed for a throne that was never questioned, while I sat across the table learning how to make myself smaller, quieter, less visible. What I didn't understand back then was that invisibility was not accidental. It was strategy. The Mercer family wasn't just rich, they were structured like a machine, and I was one of the hidden parts that absorbed pressure so the rest of the system could keep functioning without failure. It started with small things at first, paperwork I didn't remember signing, financial documents tied to my name that I only saw months later when my credit reports started behaving like they belonged to someone else. I told myself it was mistakes, clerical errors, family business complications I didn't need to worry about because Evan was handling things. That was the phrase they used constantly. Evan is handling things, as if my brother had become a natural force rather than a person. I didn't question it deeply until I met Maya, a legal consultant brought in temporarily to audit internal contracts for a development project the Mercer company was preparing. She wasn't impressed by titles or family names. She looked at data like it had weight and consequences, and the first thing she said to me after reviewing a single folder was something I never forgot. She said I wasn't disorganized, I was being used. I laughed at first because it sounded absurd, but then she showed me signatures that weren't mine, approvals linked to devices I didn't own, and financial liabilities that had been quietly redirected onto my identity profile over years. That night I stayed awake going through file after file she had flagged, and the pattern wasn't just clear, it was surgical. Every failure Evan created was softened, absorbed, or erased through adjustments made under my name, like I was a buffer account for his life. The more I looked, the more I realized something terrifying. This wasn't incompetence, it was design. Someone inside my family had built a system where Evan could never fall, because I would always be positioned underneath him to absorb the impact. When I finally confronted my father, I expected anger or denial, something human. But instead I got something far worse, calm acceptance. He didn't even deny it. He just looked at me like I was asking why a building uses foundations. He said I was always meant to support the legacy, not become it. That was the moment something inside me stopped trying to belong, because I understood what he was really saying. I was never a son in their story, I was infrastructure. The next morning my access card stopped working. My accounts began freezing under internal review. And then came the public collapse I didn't see coming fast enough. A post released by a former associate of the Mercer company, accusing me of internal financial misconduct, corruption, and sabotage. My name, my identity, my entire reputation was turned into a controlled narrative before I had even been informed I was being erased. Calls came in nonstop, but none of them were from people asking what happened. They were from people deciding what I had done. And the worst part was realizing how quickly a name becomes a verdict when enough powerful people agree on the version they want to believe. That night Maya came to my apartment again, but this time she didn't come alone. She brought someone who didn't look at me like a victim or a suspect, but like a case that had already started moving through a system. He opened his laptop, placed it on my table, and said one sentence that changed everything. He said, "They didn't just try to discredit you, they tried to structurally replace you." And as the words settled in the room, Maya looked at me and said something even heavier. She said, "If you do nothing, you won't just lose your life. You'll lose your name completely." And that's when I realized this wasn't a conflict I was trapped in. It was a system I had unknowingly been built to serve. And now that system was preparing to discard me entirely. And the worst part, I was starting to understand that they had already planned who would replace me. I learned something that night that changed the way I saw everything. Silence in a system like mine is not peace, it is preparation. After Maya and the investigator left my apartment, I sat alone staring at the same documents I had been avoiding for years. Not because I didn't understand them, but because I finally did. Every forged signature, every redirected loan, every liability quietly absorbed under my identity wasn't random damage. It was coordinated placement, like pieces on a board I was never told I was playing on. Evan wasn't just my brother. He was the visible asset, the polished face of a structure I had been unknowingly stabilizing my entire adult life. And I, Daniel Mercer, was the invisible account that carried the risk so he could carry the praise. When Maya returned the next morning, she didn't knock like someone visiting. She walked in like someone who already understood my answer hadn't changed. She placed a second folder on my table, heavier this time, and said nothing at first, just watched me open it. Inside wasn't more suspicion, it was confirmation. Internal Mercer communications, emails I had never seen, legal instructions that explicitly referenced rerouting financial exposure away from Evan's ventures and consolidating it under my profile to preserve public continuity. That was the phrase they used. Preserve public continuity, like I was a sacrifice written into their business model. I remember asking her one question, not about legality, not about consequences, but about intention. I asked her if they knew what this would do to me. She didn't hesitate when she answered. She said they knew. That's why it works. That was the moment something inside me stopped asking why and started asking how far they had already taken it. The answer came faster than I expected. That afternoon, I was called into what was supposed to be a routine internal review at the Mercer headquarters, a glass building that always felt too clean to be honest. When I walked in, Evan was already there, sitting at the head of the table like he had always belonged there more than I ever had. My father didn't even look at me when I entered. He just slid a folder across the table and said there had been irregularities tied to my accounts that needed clarification. But I had seen enough patterns now to recognize choreography when I saw it. This wasn't a review, it was containment. Evan finally spoke during that meeting, not to defend me, but to define me. He said mistakes had been made, that I had become emotionally unstable under pressure, that the company had no choice but to temporarily restrict my access for the integrity of ongoing operations. And I realized then how easily a lie becomes official when it is delivered in the right room with the right voices. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I just watched them rewrite me in real time while pretending I was still part of the conversation. By the time I left the building that day, I was no longer an employee. I was an internal risk flagged for review, a phrase so sterile it almost sounded like I didn't exist at all. That night Maya met me again, but this time she didn't bring paperwork. She brought strategy. She told me something I didn't expect. She said we weren't going to defend my identity, we were going to reconstruct theirs. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not fear, something colder, something focused, because I finally understood what they had built wasn't just a lie about me. It was a system that depended on me never fighting back with evidence. And Maya looked at me and said the final thing that night that I still remember exactly. She said, "They didn't erase you, Daniel. They just assumed you would never look back at the blueprint." And that was the moment I decided I was done being the part of their system that breaks quietly. I learned the difference between revenge and correction the day Maya showed me the full map of what my family had built. It wasn't just a company. It was an ecosystem of redirected failures, hidden liabilities, and controlled narratives. And at the center of it all was a single assumption they had never questioned, that I would always absorb the damage silently. Evan had spent his entire life being protected from consequence, but I had spent mine becoming the consequence absorber. When I finally saw the full structure laid out in front of me, I didn't feel emotional. I felt something far more dangerous. Clarity. Maya and the investigator didn't ask me if I was ready. They just asked me one question: whether I still had access to any dormant legal authority tied to my early contracts with the Mercer Development Division. I did. That was their first mistake. They never fully erased my access, they only buried it under layers of assumption. What they didn't know was that every assumption they made about me had become a vulnerability they left behind. The first move wasn't loud. It was administrative. A single legal trigger initiated under clauses they had ignored for years. Clauses that required joint liability disclosure for any internal financial restructuring, exceeding a threshold Evan had crossed repeatedly without oversight. When that trigger activated, it didn't accuse anyone, it simply forced transparency. And transparency is something their system was never built to survive. Within days, internal auditors began pulling records that had been selectively hidden for years. The same forged approvals, the same redirected liabilities, The same internal rerouting that had been used to stabilize Evan's failures all surfaced at once, not as accusations, but as documented structure. And the moment that structure became visible, it stopped being protectable. Evan tried to contact me first, not to apologize, but to contain. I didn't answer. My father attempted to reframe the situation as miscommunication within family operations. But the language no longer worked outside their controlled environment. Because this time the people reviewing the evidence weren't family, they were regulators. Maya didn't celebrate any of it. She stayed focused, guiding every submission, every filing, every response like she was dismantling something she had studied for years. And maybe she had. Because she told me something one night that stayed with me. She said systems like this don't collapse from attacks. They collapse from exposure. And that's exactly what happened. No dramatic confrontation. No shouting matches. Just a slow, irreversible withdrawal of every illusion they had built around Evan's success and my invisibility. When the financial structures froze, Evan's projects stalled immediately because they were never truly his. They were subsidized by my absorbed liability profile. When that profile was legally separated, everything built on top of it lost structural support. It wasn't destruction, it was physics. The final meeting I attended wasn't with my family. It was with external compliance auditors. Evan was there, but he didn't look like the version of himself I had grown up under. For the first time, he looked like what he actually was, someone standing without the system that carried him. My father tried to speak to me privately afterward, but there was nothing left to say. He kept repeating that I had misunderstood the intention of family responsibility, but I realized then that he had never understood the difference between responsibility and exploitation. I walked out of that building without turning back, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I finally understood I didn't need to. Outside, Maya was waiting in the car, and she didn't ask me how it felt. She just said, "It's done." And for the first time in my life, I believed her. Months later, there was no dramatic aftermath, no public collapse of screaming headlines, just silence where their influence used to be. Evan disappeared from executive visibility, not as punishment, but as consequence. My father's authority dissolved into oversight committees. The Mercer name still existed, but it no longer carried weight in rooms that mattered. And me, I wasn't restored to anything because I didn't go back. I built something new with Maya, something that didn't require erasing anyone else to exist. Sometimes people think revenge is about destruction, but what I learned is much simpler. The most complete form of it is not fighting harder. It is stepping out of the system that needed you to suffer for it to function. And when I finally did that, I didn't just take my life back, I proved something they never believed possible, that I was never their foundation. I was the reason their foundation worked. Thank you for listening to this story. If it connected with you, take a moment to reflect on your own boundaries, your own peace, and the people you allow in your life. Sometimes walking away isn't loss, it's the beginning of freedom.